The auction block at Stonehollow Vigil smelled of tar smoke and fear, and Peter Drake was close enough to see the chain marks on her wrists when Warlord Krugesh Ironjaw slammed a purse of gold onto the trading dais and roared, "Done! She is mine!" The crowd in the market square went quiet the way crowds do when something is about to break. Urzoth Bonecrusher stood on the raised platform between two orc guardsmen, her wrists bound in iron, her jaw set like a woman who had long ago decided that screaming changed nothing. She was tall even among her own kind, her shoulders broad and corded with muscle beneath a fitted set of dark leather armor, a bodice of tanned hide laced tight across her chest and studded with dull bronze rivets, sleeves cut away to bare arms crossed with old scars. A fur-trimmed mantle hung from one shoulder, the only softness on her, and her tusks caught the gray mountain light when she finally turned her head to look at the man who had just bought her like a plow horse. Warlord Hodge Cragram, the seller, grinned with all his broken teeth and reached to unlock the contract chain looped at her collar, the physical proof of a debt bond that had passed from clan to clan for 6 long years since the Bonecrusher hold fell in the Ash War. "She has never lost a match," Hodge said to the gathered crowd of traders and mercenaries and monastery guards, as though praising livestock. "Undefeated in 11 trials. You will make your fortune on her back, Krugesh." Peter had come up the mountain road that morning for one reason only: to collect payment from the monastery stewards for the ship's ribs and deck planking his yard in Saltmere Harbor, had spent 3 months bending and fitting for the Vigil's supply barges. He was not a man who involved himself in warlord business. He was 26 years old, broad in the shoulder from a decade of hauling timber and driving pegs, plain-faced, quiet, the kind of man other men forgot was in the room until they needed something built. He had planned to collect his coin, buy a hot meal, and start back down before nightfall. He had not planned on the sound Urzoth Bonecrusher made when the chain came free of the platform ring and Krugesh's men moved to lead her away like a mule on a lead rope. It was not a scream. It was worse than that. It was silence, the silence of someone swallowing 100 protests because she had learned long ago that protests earned nothing but a harder hand. Peter did not decide to speak. His mouth simply opened before his mind caught up to it. "The deal is refused," he said. The words came out louder than he intended, cracking across the square, and every head turned. Krugesh Ironjaw's grin died. Hodge Cragram's hand froze on the chain. "What did you say, human?" Krugesh's voice was a low grind of stone on stone. Peter's heart was hammering so hard he thought the whole square must hear it, but he made himself walk forward, past the startled monastery guards, until he stood at the foot of the dais looking up at the orc woman in chains. Up close her eyes were a deep amber, and they had fixed on him with a look that was not gratitude. It was disbelief, sharp and almost angry, as if she thought he was either a fool or a corpse walking. "I said the deal is refused," Peter repeated, steadier now. "By right of the Vigil's old law, fire right." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Even the monastery's own robed stewards, who had been watching the sale with bored detachment, straightened at that word. Firelight was older than the trials, older than the walls of Stonehollow Vigil itself, a custom carried down from the orc clans of the high passes, and grudgingly honored within the sanctuary town, because half its trade depended on orc caravans who would deal with no one who disrespected it. To offer a stranger the warmest place at your hearth was to declare, before every witness who mattered, that you took that person under your protection, that any harm done to them was harm done to you, and that any claim of ownership over them was void the moment the offer was accepted. It was rarely invoked. It was never invoked by a human for an orc. "You," Krugesh said, his tusks working with fury, "are offering firelight to my bonded fighter." "I am," Peter said, and his voice did not shake, though every part of him was shaking inside. Urzoth Bonecrusher looked down at him from the platform, chains still hanging loose from her wrists, and for one long breath the entire market square held still, waiting to see whether she would laugh at him, or spit at his feet, or simply walk away and let the warlord settle it with steel the way such things were usually settled. Instead she said, low enough that only he and the men closest heard it, "Do you even understand what you have just done, little shipwright?" "No," Peter admitted. "But I know what I saw, and I am not letting them drag you off like cattle while I stand here with my mouth shut." Something moved behind her amber eyes then, something quick and unreadable, gone before he could name it. The monastery steward, an older man in gray wool robes with the vigil's carved stone sigil at his breast, stepped forward with the particular caution of a man who did not want to be the one to decide this. "The custom is recognized within these walls," he said carefully. "If the claim is made openly, and the one claimed accepts, no purchase contract signed on vigil ground may override it until the matter is settled by the elders." Krugesh's hand went to the haft of the war axe at his belt. Hodge Cragram, sensing the wind changing, quietly began backing toward the edge of the platform, his gold purse still clutched to his chest, already calculating whether he might keep both the coin and his skin. "Settle it then," Krugesh snarled. "Elders, now, I will not be robbed of a fighter I have paid for by some dock rat with more mouth than sense." Urzoth Bonecrusher's eyes had never left Peter's face. "I accept," she said, loud enough this time for the whole square to hear, and the words landed on Peter like a physical weight, because he understood, even as relief and terror mixed together in his chest, that he had just changed the shape of his entire life in the time it took to say 4 words. The elders of Stonehollow Vigil convened within the hour in the round stone hall beneath the bell tower. 3 robed monastics seated behind a long table scarred by centuries of disputes settled and unsettled, while Peter stood before them with sweat cooling on his back, and Urzoth stood a few feet away, finally free of her chains, rubbing absently at the raw skin of her wrists. The eldest of the 3, a woman with a face like weathered granite named Elder Ussa, studied Peter for a long moment. "You are Peter Drake, the shipwright from Saltmere. You delivered the barge timber this season." "Yes, Elder. You have no clan holding here, no standing among the warlords. You understand that by invoking fireright for an unwed man toward an unwed woman not of your blood, the custom presumes courtship. It is not a shield offered lightly between strangers. It declares intent." Peter felt his face go hot. Beside him, he heard Urzoth make a small sound that might have been a scoff, or might have been a laugh badly disguised. "I understand," Peter said, though in truth he had understood none of this an hour ago, and was only now grasping the size of the trap he had built for himself with his own tongue. "And you," Elder Ussa said, turning her gaze on Urzoth, "you accepted before this council and before witnesses in the square. You understand the custom binds you as much as it binds him. Until the debt contract on your person is formally dissolved or challenged, and won in single combat, this man stands as your protector of record. Any warlord wishing to reclaim your bond must challenge him directly, or challenge the fireright itself before this council with proof of fraud." "I understand it very well, Elder," Urzoth said, and there was iron in her voice, though her eyes flicked once briefly toward Peter as if reassessing him again. "Better than the fool who offered it, I suspect." A low chuckle rippled among the 2 younger elders. Elder Ussa did not smile. "Then it stands," she said. "Warlord Krugesh, your purchase is void while the fireright holds. Warlord Hodge, you will return the gold, as the contract you attempted to transfer was never yours to sell, while a claim of protection was pending recognition." Krugesh's roar of outrage echoed off the stone walls, but even he knew better than to draw steel inside the vigil's council chamber, where the monastery's own sworn guard stood thick along the walls with spears grounded but ready. He stormed out with a promise on his lips that this was not finished, that fireright or no fireright, he would have what he had paid for one way or another, and the doors slammed shut behind him hard enough to rattle the high windows. When the chamber had emptied, and it was only the 3 of them and the monastery guards left, Elder Ussa fixed Peter with a look that was almost, though not quite, sympathetic. "You have made a dangerous enemy today, shipwright, for a woman you have known less than an hour. I hope you are prepared for what follows." "I don't know what follows," Peter admitted. "I only knew what I couldn't watch happen." Elder Us's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That," she said, "is either the beginning of great foolishness or great courage. History rarely tells the two apart until much later." Outside in the cold mountain air, with the bells of the vigil ringing the evening hour somewhere above them, Urzoth Bonecrusher finally turned to face Peter fully for the first time since the square. And up close, without chains, without a crowd, she was even more staggering than he had realized. She stood a full head taller than him, her amber eyes level with the top of his brow, her tusks small and neat where some orcs let theirs grow long and yellowed with age. And there was a kind of terrible, coiled grace in the way she moved, like a war hammer that had been taught, very reluctantly, to walk quietly. "So," she said, crossing her arms, the movement drawing his eye to the corded muscle of her forearms before he made himself look away. "You have made yourself my keeper, little shipwright." "Peter," he said, "my name is Peter Drake. I know your name. The whole square heard your name shouted like a challenge. I am asking what you think you have bought yourself, offering that custom to a stranger." "I didn't buy anything," Peter said. "I'm not Krugesh. I don't want to own you." "No." Her eyebrow arched, and there was something dangerously close to amusement in it now, though her voice stayed hard as flint. "Then what do you want, Peter Drake, that you would stand alone against an armed warlord for a woman you have never met?" He thought about lying, about giving some noble speech, but something about the directness of her gaze made lying feel like an insult. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I saw them trading you like you were a plow horse, and I couldn't stand there and let it happen. That's the whole truth of it. I didn't plan past that." For a long moment she studied him, and he had the distinct sense of being weighed, measured, priced by someone far more used to judging danger than he would ever be. "You are either the bravest fool I have met in 6 years of chains," she said finally, "or the stupidest man in Stonehollow Vigil, possibly both." Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. That surprised a short bark of laughter out of her, quickly smothered, as if laughing were a habit she had misplaced somewhere along the way and was startled to find again. "Well," she said, "since it seems I am bound to your fire whether I like it or not, shipwright, you had best have a fire worth sitting at." "Show me." "She sees you," he thought, and did not know yet how much that single fact would come to mean to him. He only knew that his life, an hour ago simple and small and lonely in the way that men who work with their hands and go home to empty rooms are often lonely, had just been cracked open, and something enormous and orange-eyed was standing in the gap looking back at him as if deciding whether he was worth staying for. "This way," he said, and led her through the narrow stone streets of the vigil toward the guest hall where the monastery lodged tradesmen during the trial season, painfully aware of every eye that followed them, and painfully aware, too, of how close she walked beside him, as though some part of her had already, however grudgingly, decided he was hers to guard as much as he was hers to be guarded by. The guest hall room the monastery had given Peter for his stay was small and plain, a stone hearth, a narrow bed, a table scarred with old knife marks where previous tenants had whittled or eaten or both. He built the fire himself, kneeling to coax the kindling while Urzoth stood near the door watching him with the wary stillness of someone used to sleeping with one eye open. "There's only the one bed," he said, feeling the heat climb his neck. "I'll take the floor. You should have the fire's warmth, since that's the whole point of the custom anyway." "You truly do not understand firelight," she said, not unkindly, settling herself instead onto a low stool near the hearth rather than the bed, close enough to the flames that the orange light caught the planes of her face. "It is not about a mattress, Peter Drake. It is about the warmest place. This." Gestured at the stool at the fire itself. "The seat nearest the flame, that is the whole of it. A host does not give up his bed to prove protection. He gives up his comfort, small things done without needing to be told twice. Then I've already done it wrong once, Peter said, dropping onto the floor across from her, arms over his knees. I offered before I even understood what I was offering. You offered because your gut told you something was wrong, and you listened to it instead of your fear. She studied him over the fire, the light dancing gold across her tusks. That is rarer than you think, among your people or mine. They sat a while in silence, the fire cracking, and Peter found himself unable to stop stealing glances at her, the strong line of her jaw, the old white scar that crossed one eyebrow, the way her hands, scarred and calloused as any soldier's, rested loosely on her knees in a stillness that felt coiled rather than relaxed, like a bowstring at rest. "Tell me what happened," he said finally. "Why you were bonded. I heard the warlord say something about the Ash War." Urzoth's jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would refuse. Then, quietly, watching the fire rather than him, she began to speak. "My clan was called Bonecrusher for 4 generations before I was born. We held the high passes east of the Vigil, good grazing land, iron in the hills. 6 years ago the Ironjoe and Kragram warbands allied against us over a dispute about water rights that was never truly about water at all. It was about land they wanted and did not have the numbers to take honestly. They burned our hold, killed my father, my 2 brothers. What was left of my clan, perhaps 40 of us, mostly old and young, was absorbed into Kragram's holding as debt-bonded servants, our clan name struck from the roll of recognized clans. I was 17, old enough to fight. So they made me fight in the trial circuit, and every purse I won went to service my clan's debt, and every year the debt somehow never shrank because Kragram priced my keep and my armor and my very existence against it faster than I could win coin to pay it down." "That's not a debt," Peter said, anger rising in him despite himself. "That's a cage dressed up as arithmetic." "Yes," she said simply. "I have always known that, knowing it changes nothing. I have won 11 trial circuits. I am, without false modesty, the finest blade-and-axe fighter in 3 warlord territories, and still I am chained and sold between men who never once had to swing a weapon themselves to earn what I earned for them." Her hands curled slowly into fists on her knees. "This year's trials at the Vigil carry a prize purse large enough, finally, to buy back my clan's name outright if I win the final match. Restore the Bonecrusher clan to the rolls. Free my remaining kin from bond service. That is why I am here, not for glory for them." Peter watched her in the firelight, and something in his chest ached in a way he had no name for yet. "Then you're going to win it," he said. She looked at him, surprised, as if she had expected doubt rather than certainty. "You say that as though it is a simple thing." "I say it because I watched you stand on that platform in chains and not once did you look beaten. A woman like that doesn't lose a fight she spent 6 years training her whole life toward." Something shifted in her expression, softer than anything he had seen from her yet, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. "You are a strange man, Peter Drake." "So I've been told. Mostly by dockhands who think a shipwright who reads at night instead of drinking is odd company." "No," she said. "I mean you are strange because you speak to me as though I am a person rather than a prize or a monster. Even the monks who tolerate my presence within these walls do so with their eyes elsewhere. You look at me." A pause. "It is unsettling. I'll stop if it bothers you." "I did not say it bothered me," she said, and the low note in her voice, the way her amber eyes held his a heartbeat longer than was strictly comfortable, sent a bolt of heat through him that had nothing to do with the fire between them. He looked away first, clearing his throat, aware of his own pulse. "You should sleep," he said. "Whatever's coming tomorrow, you'll want your strength." She did not sleep for a long while, he noticed, watching the fire instead with the wary patience of a warrior who had learned the hard way that safety was a story told to children. But eventually her shoulders eased, and she stretched out along the stone floor nearest the hearth rather than take the bed he offered again, curling one arm beneath her head. And Peter lay awake on the far side of the small room, listening to her breathing even out, thinking that he had never in his life felt less alone in a room, and more entirely unmoored from everything he thought he understood about his own quiet, ordinary existence. The next morning, the trials of the vigil resumed in the stone-ringed arena carved into the mountainside below the monastery's upper wall, and Peter watched from the rail as Urzoth Bonecrusher fought a Kragram champion twice her width and put him on his back in under a minute with a series of movements so economical they looked almost gentle, until the man did not get up. The crowd roared. Urzoth did not smile. She simply turned, found Peter's face among the hundreds along the rail, and held his gaze for one long breath before walking off the sand to have her wounds checked, and Peter's chest filled with something fierce and unfamiliar that he was slowly beginning to recognize as pride, entangled hopelessly with something warmer still. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both, in their separate ways, came to treasure. Urzoth fought her matches in the mornings when the mountain air was cold and sharp, and in the afternoons Peter worked at the monastery's request, repairing storage sheds and reinforcing the old wooden scaffolding along the outer wall where winter frost had cracked the mortar, his shipwright's hands finding easy purchase in problems of joints and load and leverage, even when the material was stone instead of oak. In the evenings they shared the small hearth in the guest hall, and slowly, meal by meal, story by story, the pretense of the arrangement began to wear thin in places neither of them mentioned aloud. He learned that she liked her meat charred nearly black, that she hummed old clan war songs under her breath when she thought he was not listening, that she had carried a small carved bone token from her dead father's belt through 6 years of bondage, and never once let anyone take it from her, hidden always in a hem or a boot or clenched in her fist during matches she was afraid to lose. She learned that he had grown up an only child in Saltmere Harbor after his mother died of a lung fever when he was 12, and his father drowned in a storm 2 years after that he had built his first boat alone at 19 with borrowed tools and sold it to buy the lease on his yard, that he had never once in his adult life had someone wait for him at a fire, and that admission, offered quietly one night with his eyes on the flames rather than on her, made something in Urzoth Bonecrusher's chest twist in a way she did not examine too closely. "You are alone in the world too, then," she said. "Same as me." "Was," Peter said. "Present tenses getting complicated." She huffed something that was almost a laugh and reached across the small space between them, and for a moment her rough, scarred hand rested against his jaw, tilting his face toward hers with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the strength he knew lived in that hand. "It is complicated for me also," she admitted, voice low. "I did not intend to feel anything toward the fool who offered me his fire out of nothing but stubborn decency. I have spent 6 years learning to want nothing I could be made to lose. Wanting is dangerous for someone like me." "I'm not going anywhere," Peter said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. "Everyone says that," she murmured, "until the warlords make a different offer. Then let them make it. I already refused one deal in the middle of a crowded square. I've got no trouble refusing another." Her thumb traced once, slowly, along his jaw, and then, as if she had made a decision that had been building in her for days, she closed the last distance between them and kissed him, not gentle, not tentative, but with the same fierce certainty she brought to everything, one hand fisting in the front of his shirt as if daring him to pull away, and Peter did not pull away. He answered her with his whole chest aching. And when they finally broke apart, she was breathing hard and there was a fire in her amber eyes that had nothing to do with the hearth. "That," she said, "was not part of any custom." "No," Peter agreed, dazed. "That one was just us." They did not speak of it again that night, but something had shifted permanently between them, and both of them knew it, and both of them, for very different reasons rooted in very different kinds of loneliness, were terrified of how much they wanted to keep it. Word came up the mountain road 8 days later, carried breathless by a monastery courier, that Warlord Krugesh Ironjaw had broken camp from his holding in the eastern passes, and was marching a raiding band of some 200 warriors toward Stonehollow Vigil, declaring before witnesses that he intended to reclaim what had been stolen from him by fraud, and that any wall built by monks would not stand between him and his property. The council of elders convened the town square within the hour, and Peter stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with Urzoth beside him, watching Elder Ussa lay out the grim mathematics of it. The vigil's sworn guard numbered perhaps 60 spears, supplemented by whatever tradesmen and pilgrims currently sheltering within the walls could be armed and organized, against a warband nearly 4 times that size, arriving within the week. "We are a sanctuary town," Elder Ussa said grimly, "not a fortress. Our walls were built to keep out weather and wolves, not a warlord's army." "Then we make them stronger," Peter said, before he had quite decided to speak, and every head in the square turned toward him for the second time in a fortnight. He felt his face heat, but he pushed on. "I've spent 10 years building hulls that hold against storms that would splinter a badly joined ship in an hour. Your gate is oak, your wall is stone and old mortar, and both have weaknesses I can see just standing here. Give me the timber from the storage sheds, the pitch from the barge stores, and every able hand you can spare, and I can reinforce that gate and shore the weak sections of the wall inside a week." Elder Ussa studied him a long moment, the way she had studied him in the council chamber weeks before. "You would put your own hands to the defense of a town you have no blood claim to, shipwright." "I've got a claim now," Peter said, and did not look at Urzoth, though he felt her gaze on him like a physical weight. "Same as any of you." The next 6 days passed in a blur of hard, exhausting labor. Peter organized crews of dock workers, monks, and pilgrims into teams, showing them how to double-brace the great gate with crossed oak beams salvaged from the storage sheds, how to mix pitch and tar into a paste that could be smeared along the base of the wooden palisade sections to make them resist fire, how to rig a counterweighted boom system, borrowed from ship-rigging principles, that could drop a secondary gate of iron-shod timber behind the main one in seconds if the outer gate was breached, buying the defenders crucial time to fall back to the inner square. Urzoth fought her remaining trials matches in the mornings, each one shorter and more brutal than the last as word of the coming siege, put a hard edge on every fighter in the arena, and spent her afternoons at Peter's side on the wall, not merely watching but working, hauling timber that took 2 ordinary men to lift, holding braces steady while he drove pegs, and more than once catching a falling beam meant to crush an inattentive worker with nothing but her own braced arms. It was during one such afternoon, with the western wall half finished and dusk creeping down the mountain, that the trouble came that neither of them had seen brewing. A cluster of sellswords and dockhands, hired up from Saltmere to help haul stone for the wall, had been drinking through their midday break, and by the time work resumed their courage had loosened along with their tongues. Their leader, a broad, red-faced man named Fenric Coyle, who had once tried and failed to win a shipyard contract from Peter years before and never forgotten the slight, planted himself in the middle of the half-built wall and called out loud enough for half the work crew to hear. "Here's the great protector," Fenric sneered, jerking his chin at Peter. "Little shipwright who talked his way into an orc champion's bed with nothing but a fireside trick. Tell me, Drake, what happens when Ironjaw's boys come over that wall? You going to hide behind her skirts, or are you going to stand and prove you're half the man you claim to be in that square?" The crew went quiet. Peter felt the old, familiar heat of shame climb his neck, the same feeling he'd carried through a childhood of being smaller and quieter than the other harbor boys, of being overlooked, mocked, dismissed. Beside him he felt Urzoth go rigid, her hand drifting toward the axe at her hip, and he knew with sudden, terrible clarity, that if she moved now, if she stepped forward and put Fenric Coyle on his back in front of the entire work crew the way she'd put down warriors twice his size in the arena, it would not defend him. It would bury him. Every man on that wall would remember for the rest of his life in Stonehollow Vigil that the shipwright had needed his orc woman to fight his battles for him. "Urzoth," Peter said quietly without looking at her, "don't." She went still. He felt the effort it cost her, the coiled violence in her held perfectly, dangerously in check. "Fenric," Peter said, turning to face the man fully, keeping his voice level though his heart was slamming against his ribs. "You want to test whether I'm half the man I claim to be? Fine. Doc rules. No weapons. First man down or first man who yields, right here." A murmur of surprise ran through the gathered crew. Fenric's grin widened, delighted at the prospect of an easy beating in front of witnesses. "You sure about that, little shipwright? I've put bigger men than you in the dirt for less." "I'm sure," Peter said, though he was not sure at all, his hands already trembling faintly at his sides. Urzoth caught his sleeve as he stepped forward, her grip fierce, her voice a low, urgent whisper meant only for him. "You do not have to do this to prove anything to me." "I know," Peter said. "I'm doing it so I can still look at myself tomorrow." Something in her face shifted, not fear for him exactly, but a fierce, focused attention, the look of a warrior assessing a fight she desperately wanted to win for someone else and could not. "Then listen to me," she said quickly, quietly, turning her body so it looked, to anyone watching, like nothing more than a woman standing near her man before a brawl. "He leads with his right always when he is angry because it is his strongest hand and he trusts it too much. He will try to close the distance fast to use his size. Do not let him close. Use the timber piles. Make him come around them. Tire his legs before his arms ever reach you." Peter absorbed this in the space of 2 heartbeats, and then Fenric was closing, exactly as she'd said, arm cocking back for a heavy right hook, and Peter did not plant his feet and trade blows like a fool. He stepped sideways around a stacked pile of raw timber, forcing Fenric to check his charge and go around it, and did it again, and again, using the half-finished wall itself as a maze, until the bigger man was breathing hard and cursing and had thrown 3 wild, wasted punches at empty air. The crew's laughter, which had started at Peter's expense, began to shift, chuckling now at Fenric stumbling after a man half his size like a bull chasing a sparrow. Fenric, red-faced with humiliation now rather than mere anger, abandoned strategy entirely and simply charged. And Peter, remembering 10 years of shifting heavy timber loads on uneven docks, dropped low and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection exactly as he would when wrestling a stubborn ship's rib into place, using leverage rather than strength. And Fenric Coyle went down hard onto a stack of loose planking with a crash that knocked the wind entirely out of him. Peter stood over him, breathing hard, fists still raised, and Fenric, staring up dazed, finally raised a hand in grudging surrender. The work crew erupted, not in mockery now but in something closer to rough approval, a few men clapping Peter on the shoulder as he stepped back, and it was only then, only once the fight was truly won and witnessed and could not be taken from him, that Urzoth Bonecrusher stepped forward. She did not gloat. She did not fight the fallen man for the insult, though Peter suspected some part of her wanted to. Instead she looked out over the assembled crew, Orcamber eyes hard and clear, and said, loud enough for every man there to hear, "I have fought 11 trial circuits and killed better warriors than any of you will ever meet. I did not choose Peter Drake because he could match me blow for blow in a fight. I chose to accept his fire because he stood alone before an armed warlord for a stranger, and because he has more courage in one afternoon of honest labor than most men manage in a lifetime of boasting. Remember that, the next time you think his quiet means he is weak." The square was silent, and then, slowly, one of the older dockhands began to clap, and the sound spread, ragged and genuine, and Fenric Coyle picked himself up off the planking and slunk away without another word. And Peter stood in the center of it all with his knuckles aching and his chest full to bursting. Because for the first time in his life, in front of a crowd, he had been seen not as small or overlooked, but as a man worth standing beside. That night back at the small hearth in the guest hall, Urzoth pressed a cool, wet cloth to the bruise darkening along Peter's jaw with hands far gentler than he had ever seen her use. "You could have let me end that in 3 seconds, she said. "I know. You would rather bleed a little than let me fight your battles for you. I'd rather earn my place at your fire than have it handed to me," Peter said, wincing as she dabbed the cloth against a split knuckle. "Same as you're earning yours in that arena every morning. I watched you do it. Seemed only fair I do the same." She set the cloth aside slowly, and her hand lingered against his cheek, thumb brushing gently over the bruise, and when she spoke her voice had lost every trace of its usual iron. "No one has ever thought of me as someone whose respect needed earning, Peter Drake. Only as something to be won, or kept, or traded. You are the first person in 6 years who has made me feel like a person choosing, rather than a prize being chosen for." "Then choose," Peter said quietly, his own voice rough. "Not the custom, not the shipwright, just choose, whatever that means to you." Urzoth Bonecrusher looked at him for a long, searching moment, firelight dancing across the scar above her eyebrow, and then she leaned down and kissed him again, slower this time, deeper, one hand sliding into his hair as though she meant to memorize the shape of him, and when she finally drew back, her forehead rested against his, both of them breathing unsteadily. "I choose you," she murmured. "Gods help us both, I choose you." They had perhaps 4 days left before Krugesh Ironjaw's warband was due to arrive, and in that time the wall grew stronger. The gate's counterweighted boom mechanism was tested and refined, until it could drop the inner barrier in under 10 seconds. And something quiet and certain grew between Peter Drake and Urzoth Bonecrusher that neither of them tried to hide any longer. Not from each other, and increasingly, not from the town watching them work side by side on the ramparts. It was on the third of those 4 days that everything nearly came apart entirely. A monastery guard was found beaten and robbed near the storage sheds at dawn, his coin purse missing, a distinctive orc-forged dagger left carelessly behind at the scene. A dagger that, when brought before the elders, was identified by a trembling, coached witness as belonging to Urzoth Bonecrusher. She was arrested within the hour, dragged from the wall where she had been hauling stone, her protests that she had been nowhere near the sheds at the hour in question, drowned out by Brother Castellan Aldrich, the monastery's second elder, a thin, sharp-eyed man who had quietly taken over much of the council's daily administration in recent months, and who now stood before the gathered crowd, declaring that the sanctity of the vigil could not shelter a violent thief, shipwright or no shipwright, and that the penalty for assault upon a sworn guard within these walls was death by the long drop from the eastern wall at dawn. Peter's blood went to ice. "This is a lie," he shouted, shoving through the crowd toward the small stone jail where they had already begun leading her. "She was with me at the sheds all morning, checking the wall braces. Ask any of the crew. The crew you speak of has already been questioned," Brother Castellan said smoothly, "and none can account for her whereabouts in the specific hour the guard was attacked. The dagger is proof enough. I am sorry, shipwright. I know this pains you, but the law of this sanctuary must hold, or it holds for no one." Elder Ussa's face was troubled, but even she, bound by the council's procedures, could not simply overturn a formal accusation without proof of innocence, and the hours that followed were a nightmare Peter would remember for the rest of his life. Urzoth locked in a bare stone cell, her wrists chained again for the first time since the market square, her amber eyes burning not with fear but with a cold, banked fury at the injustice of it. While Peter tore through the town, searching desperately for anyone who had seen her that morning, anyone who might know the truth. He found it finally in the last hour before dawn from an unlikely source, a young acolyte named Sister Mira, barely 20 years old, who had been assigned to sweep the storage yard at first light and who came to Peter trembling, terrified of what she had seen and even more terrified of what it meant to speak against Brother Castellan. "I saw him," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the stones themselves might report her words. "Brother Castellan. Meeting with one of Warlord Krugash's men at the sheds 2 nights past. I heard gold change hands. I did not understand it until this morning, when they said the orc woman's dagger was found there. She never carries her dagger loose, Peter Drake. I have watched her train. She keeps it always sheathed at her hip. Someone planted it. Peter did not waste breath thanking her properly." He ran, Sister Mira hurrying breathless behind him, straight for the council chamber, only to find it empty. The elders, along with half the town, had already gathered at the eastern wall, where a gallows platform had been hastily assembled in the gray pre-dawn light, and Urzoth Bonecrusher stood upon it, wrists bound, a noose already looped and waiting, Brother Castellan reciting the sanctuary's law in a flat, ceremonial drone, while Elder Ussa watched with a face carved from stone. And at the base of the platform, arrived that very hour with a small honor guard under a flag of parley granted for the execution alone, stood Warlord Krugesh Ironjoe, arms crossed, a grim satisfaction written plain across his tusked face. "Stop!" Peter's voice tore out of him as he shoved through the crowd, Sister Mira clutching at his sleeve, both of them breathless. "Stop the execution, this is a lie. Brother Castellan took a bribe from Krugesh's men 2 nights ago. This witness saw it herself." The executioner, a monastery guard with his hand already on the lever that would drop the platform beneath Urzoth's feet, hesitated, looking to Elder Ussa for guidance. Brother Castellan's face had gone pale, then furious. "This is desperation," he spat. "A shipwright lies to save his bedmate. Guards, remove him." "Let the girl speak," Elder Ussa said, her voice cutting across the platform like a whip crack, and the executioner's hand froze on the lever. Sister Mira, shaking but resolute, repeated her account before the entire gathered town. The meeting at the sheds, the exchange of gold, the timing that placed Brother Castellan in conspiracy with Krugesh's men the very night before the attack that had never truly happened, or had happened at Castellan's own arrangement to manufacture an excuse to strip Urzoth of sanctuary protection. Krugesh's honor guard shifted uneasily. Krugesh himself said nothing, which was, in its own way, confession enough. "Search him," Elder Ussa commanded, and when the guards turned on Brother Castellan, he broke almost at once, stammering that Krugesh had offered enough gold to rebuild the entire eastern chapel roof in exchange for finding some pretext, any pretext, to nullify the shipwright claim and return the orc woman to lawful bond before the trial's final could be fought. The platform lever remained untouched, the noose still looped around Urzoth's neck, and for one more terrible moment nothing moved, the whole town holding its breath, until Elder Ussa raised a hand and said, clear and final, "Release her. Now." The guard fumbled the noose loose with shaking hands, and Urzoth stumbled forward off the platform's edge, and Peter was there, catching her, both of them nearly collapsing under the weight of relief crashing through them, her chained wrists trembling against his chest as the guards hurried to strike the iron free. Krugesh Ironjoe, seeing his manufactured pretext collapse in front of the entire town, seeing months of scheming unravel in minutes, drew himself up with what dignity he could still claim and made one last attempt. "The shipwright is a formality," he growled, striding toward the platform, gold purse once again produced from beneath his cloak, thrust toward Peter like a weapon. "Name your price, shipwright. Whatever this council decides about my elder's methods, the bond debt on that woman is still legally mine by clan right, older than any monastery custom. I will pay you triple what I offered Kragram. Take the gold. Walk away whole and rich, and no one need bleed over this." The entire square went silent, waiting. Peter Drake looked at the purse, heavy with gold that would have changed his whole quiet, hard-working life in Saltmere Harbor forever, and then he looked at Urzoth Bonecrusher, free of her chains, her amber eyes locked on his with a fierce, unspoken plea that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a choice she desperately needed him to make correctly. "The deal is refused," Peter said, for the second time in his life, and this time his voice did not shake at all. "It was refused in that market square, and it's refused now, and it'll be refused every single time you try it, Krugesh, because she is not property to be priced. Take your gold back down the mountain." Krugesh's face twisted with fury, and his hand went to his axe, but before he could speak the sound of horns split the cold morning air from the eastern watchtower, 3 long blasts that every soul in Stonehollow Vigil had been trained these last 2 weeks to dread. Warbend sighted, came the cry from the wall. Ironjaw's raiders at the eastern approach, less than an hour out. Krugash's own face went momentarily blank with confusion, and then, dark understanding, he understood what his own captains had done without waiting for his signal. His second, growing impatient with the delay at the gallows, had ordered the assault to begin regardless, gambling that whatever happened at the vigil's wall, his warlord would want his prize back one way or another. "You will not have her by treachery," Elder Ussa said coldly to Krugesh, "and it seems your own men will not let you have her by patience either. Guards, escort this warlord from the grounds under parley flag as agreed, or strike him down where he stands for the violation, your choice, Krugesh Ironjaw." Krugesh, seeing the tide of the entire town turning against him, seeing his own honor guard already glancing nervously toward the eastern wall where the horn still sounded, spat once at the ground near Peter's feet and stormed off toward the gate with what remained of his dignity, shouting orders that no one now seemed inclined to obey without question. There was no time for relief, no time for anything but motion. Peter turned to Urzoth, still rubbing feeling back into her freed wrists, and found her already shrugging her mantle back into place, her eyes hard and clear, and utterly transformed from the woman who had stood beneath a noose minutes before into the warrior who had won 11 trial circuits. "Well, shipwright," she said, a fierce, wild grin breaking across her face despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. "It seems your wall is about to be tested rather sooner than we planned." "Then let's go make sure it holds," Peter said, and together they ran for the eastern gate. The battle for Stonehollow Vigil began less than an hour later, and it was nothing like the tidy skirmishes Peter had imagined during 2 weeks of hauling timber. It was chaos and noise and terror, Krugesh's warband surging up the switchback road in a dark tide, ladders and grappling hooks flying against the reinforced palisade, the air filling with shouted orders and the whistle of thrown spears. Peter stood at the gate mechanism he himself had designed, working the counterweighted boom with 2 other dockhands, the moment the first section of outer wall buckled under a concentrated assault, dropping the iron-shod inner barrier with a thunderous crash that sealed off the breach and bought the defenders on the ramparts precious minutes to regroup. Above him, along the wall's fighting platform, Urzoth Bonecrusher fought like something out of an old war song, her axe carving a bloody arc through the first wave of raiders who managed to crest the ladders, her voice ringing out in orcish battle cries that Peter did not understand but that sent a fierce, protective thrill through him every time he heard them. Twice raiders broke through near the gate mechanism itself, and twice Peter fought them off with nothing but a boat hook and sheer desperate stubbornness, until Urzoth, catching sight of him overwhelmed by a third attacker from the wall above, did not hesitate, did not calculate whether it would humiliate him this time. There was no room left in her for anything but the animal certainty that the man she loved was in danger, and she leapt from the fighting platform straight down into the melee below, landing hard, driving her axe through the raider's guard before he could bring his blade down on Peter's unprotected back. "I told you," she snarled, hauling Peter up by the collar even as she kicked the dying man's weapon away, "that I would not lose you to anyone's blade, warlords or otherwise." "Wasn't planning on dying today," Peter gasped, "but I appreciate the help." There was no time for more than that. The battle raged on through the morning, brutal and exhausting. The defenders of Stonehollow Vigil monks and dockhands and pilgrims and tradesmen who had never held a weapon in earnest before that week, holding the line at the inner gate through sheer stubborn desperation. Peter's reinforced walls and quick-drop barrier buying time again and again. Until at last, near midday, Krugesh Ironjaw himself, furious at his warband's mounting losses against a town he had expected to fall in an hour, forced his way to the front of the assault and bellowed a challenge across the breach. "Bonecrusher, face me, or watch your little shipwright's town burn stone by stone." Urzoth did not hesitate. She dropped from the wall into the churned mud of the breach, axe in hand, and Peter's heart seized with a fear sharper than anything he'd felt all day, because he understood, watching her stride toward the massive orc warlord, that this was the fight her entire life had been building toward, the fight that would finally, one way or another, end the 6 years of chains and trading and debt that had defined her. The duel was short and savage. Krugesh was bigger, stronger in raw muscle, but Urzoth Bonecrusher had spent 6 years fighting for her life in 100 arenas, while he had spent those same years growing fat on stolen tribute and other men's labor, and it showed in every exchange. His heavy overhand blows meeting only air as she moved with the same economical, deadly grace Peter had watched drop a champion in under a minute weeks before, until finally, with a final ringing blow that knocked the axe from Krugesh's hand and drove him to his knees in the mud before the entire watching town, she stood over him with her blade at his throat, breathing hard, victorious. "By clan right and by combat," she said, loud enough for every raider on that field to hear, "the debt bond of Bonecrusher clan is dissolved this day, and any man of Ironjoe or Cragram who raises a hand against Stonehollow Vigil or the shipwright Peter Drake from this hour forward answers to me personally. Yield, or die where you kneel." Krugesh Ironjaw, beaten, humiliated, his warband already breaking and retreating down the mountain road behind him without their leader's command, yielded. The cheer that went up from the walls of Stonehollow Vigil shook dust from the old stones, and Peter, running out into the churned, blood-in mud breach without a single thought for his own safety, reached Urzoth just as she finally lowered her axe, and she turned and caught him up in an embrace that lifted him half off his feet, both of them laughing and shaking and weeping a little, unable to speak, unable to do anything but hold on. 3 days later, once Krugesh's defeated warband had been driven fully from the mountain and the last of the wounded had been tended in the monastery's infirmary, the trials of the vigil resumed for their final match, and Urzoth Bonecrusher, still bearing a fresh bandage along one forearm from the siege, walked into the arena to fight the last undefeated challenger from the Cragram warband, and Peter watched from the rail with his heart in his throat, though he already knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with having watched this woman fight for weeks, exactly how it would end. It ended, as it always seemed to with her, in under 2 minutes, her opponent flat on his back in the sand, and the prize purse enough gold to restore the Bonecrusher clan's name to the rolls, to free every remaining bonded kinsman from debt service, to buy back a small stretch of the old high-pass grazing land her father had once ruled, was carried forward on a ceremonial litter before the entire assembled crowd of the vigil. Urzoth Bonecrusher did not reach for the gold first. She turned instead, sweat-streaked and triumphant, and walked straight across the sand to where Peter Drake stood gripping the rail, and in front of the entire town, in front of the elders, in front of monks and dockhands and pilgrims, and the last remaining Ironjoe and Cragram warriors who had come to watch the final match under uneasy truce, she went down on one knee before him, an orc warrior kneeling to a human shipwright. A thing so unheard of that the crowd's roar died into stunned silence, and drew from beneath her breastplate the small carved bone token that had once belonged to her father, the one she had hidden through 6 years of chains and bondage, and never once let anyone take. From her, "Among my people," she said, her voice carrying clear across the silent arena, "there is a custom older even than fireright. When a warrior gives her father's token to another, freely before witnesses, it is a claiming, a declaration that she offers her whole self, her name, her fire, her blade, and asks the same in return, not as bond service, not as trade, but as equals standing at one hearth for the rest of their days." She looked up at him, amber eyes bright with something fiercer and more vulnerable than he had ever seen in them. "I have been traded like cattle between warlords who never once asked what I wanted. You are the first person in my life who refused to make that deal, who let me choose instead of being chosen for. So I am choosing Peter Drake before every witness who matters freely with my whole heart. Will you take this fire with me, not as protector and protected, as equals, as partners, for as long as we both draw breath?" Peter's throat was too tight to speak for a long moment, his eyes stinging, the entire arena holding its breath around them, and then he reached down and took the bone token from her open palm, closing his hand over hers. "I refused one deal for you in a market square without even knowing your name," he said, voice rough but steady. "I'd refuse 1,000 more. Yes, gods, yes, Urzoth, I choose you too. I have from the first moment you looked at me like I was something other than invisible." She rose then, and the crowd's silence broke into a roar of celebration that rivaled the cheer from the battle days before. And Urzoth Bonecrusher pulled Peter Drake into a kiss right there on the sand of the trials arena, in front of elders and warlords and monks and dockhands. A kiss that sealed the bone token between their joined hands. A kiss that tasted of victory and relief, and 6 years of chains finally, truly broken. That evening, at the threshold of the small stone house the monastery granted them at the edge of Stonehollow Vigil's upper terrace, its hearth already laid and waiting, Urzoth paused before stepping across, turning to look back at Peter with the bone token now strung on a leather cord at her throat. "This is the last threshold," she said softly. "After this one, there is no more firelight pretending, no more custom to hide behind. Only us choosing this every day because we want to." "Good," Peter said, taking her hand in his. "I never much liked pretending anyway." They crossed the threshold together, side by side, into the warmth of a fire that belonged at last and forever to both of them equally. And behind them, the bells of Stonehollow Vigil rang out over the mountain into the gathering dusk, marking not an ending, but the quiet, hard-won beginning of everything still to come.